Yep, seems good.
Okay, I guess everyone can see my screen as well.
Yep.
Yeah, so hi everyone. Nice to meet you guys. Yeah, so I'm dialing in from Singapore, so it's a bit late, as you can see from the window outside. So pardon me if I may look a bit tired right now. So anyways, it's been a pleasure to be speaking in this meetup. So today I'll be talking about looking into the Svelte compiler. So this is me. I'm Li Hau. So Tan is my family name and Li Hau is my given name. So you can call me Li Hau or Tan. I think it's okay. But this is my Twitter handle at Li Hau Tan. You can follow me on Twitter. I share things about like Svelte and React and CSS, like anything front-end related, right? So a bit about myself. I'm a front-end engineer at Shopee Singapore. So Shopee is it's an e-commerce based in Southeast Asia. But a bit of myself, actually grew up in a small town in Penang, Malaysia. So, and another thing about myself is that I'm one of the maintainers of Svelte. So today we'll be covering about Svelte compiler, but as Ilash has shared with you guys earlier on how Svelte works, right? Like how do you use Svelte, and probably what I'm going to do here is quickly do another recap. Yeah, so usually you start with having a button, having an element on the screen. So a Svelte component starts with a file that ends with a .svelte extension, and the code itself looks like HTML, right? So here you have a HTML element, and you can have a script tag where you can include like JavaScript. So here I declare a variable called count. I can use the variable inside the template via like a curly brackets, and I have so I can have the count over here, and now you can see 0 on the screen. I can add event listeners with like this. So now when I click on it, I can increment the count. So I can style it. So I can add a style tag and put styles inside. What's cool about this is that whatever styles inside here is being scoped within this component itself. So it'll be just a button that is written within this file, this component file that is styled as read and font size of 2 EM. Yeah. And one thing that is very different from other frameworks that you don't see that often is that we have this thing called a reactive declaration, which means that when you say double equals to count times 2 with a $colon sign over here, it means that the value of double is always 2 times of count. So when I increment the count, you can see that the value of double is always 2 times of it. The next thing is, so now we've seen how we can write a Svelte component. Let's think a bit like how would you implement this in vanilla JavaScript, right? So how would you implement this in just JavaScript without any framework, right? So one thing you could do is let's start with like the variables, and so to create a button, we have text nodes first, right? So to create a text, we use document or create text node. So this is one of the browser DOM API to do it, right? And then we can append it to the DOM, to the browser DOM. And to create a button, we do the same thing: document, create element, set the text content. So for event listeners, you use API like add event listeners, and then you add on to the browser. Next, what we do is that to have that interaction where when you click and then increments the value, right? What you do is that you update the value of the variable, but at the same time you call this function called updates, where you tries to update the value of the text. So here we also have to count evaluates the value of double every time, right? So because it's always 2 times of count. And lastly, for styles, you can create a style element and then you append it to the document. right? That's how you get the styles. And yeah. And then, okay, last but not the least, in order for the styles to be scoped, because if you just use button, it'll be all the buttons. For it to scope, probably we add some class with some hash, and then we also have it declared over here. So now your styles, these styles will only apply to this button instead of any other button, right? So the recurring, later on I will be showing a few examples of how you write Svelte component. But one thing I want you guys to think about is that for all the examples that you're going to see later on, think about how you're going to write it in vanilla JavaScript, right? How you're going to implement them. So one example of what you can do is Svelte is that you can have some logic blocks, right? One of it is if, so based on condition, you show element or not, right? Another thing is await. So you can pass in a promise, and then whether the promise is pending, resolved, or rejected, you can show different kind of elements. And another thing is each, where you can look through an array and then repeat your elements for each item, right? Here we can, in Svelte, you can do data binding. So there's a bind attribute, a bind directives, so data binding. Next, what you can do is you can have transitions. So you can have in animations and like different transitions in and out. Lastly, also you can have like components in Svelte, right? So in Svelte, we use like templates and slots that's more aligned to the browser custom elements API. So now we are going to cover about Svelte compiler. So so when I show you just now like how you write a Svelte component, right? And also show you that how you write JavaScript without a framework. That's actually because, sorry, I think I should go back a bit. Sorry, is that if you take a look at here, when you look at the code that is being generated, it's pretty much just similar, I would say. Okay, like you can see here, there's some sort of similarities between like the code that you just written in vanilla versus the code that's been generated out from Svelte. So Svelte is a compiler that compiles your code into JavaScript code, and it tries to generate as optimized as possible. And yeah, so that is what we're going to take a look at, how this process is going to be. Okay, so how does so before we start about talking in specific for Svelte compiler, let's take a look at how a normal compiler works. So in a compiler, usually when you write code, it will try to scan through the code character by character and then break it down into things called tokens. So one token is like one segment of code. With tokens, it will arrange it in a tree-like data structure. So this is what we call AST, abstract syntax tree. So this is a tree structure. So the compiler will then analyze this tree structure using like say depth search or graph, like those tree traversal algorithm to analyze it and process it and transform it. Say for example, we transform from the left to the right, and then from the final transform AST, we try to generate a code out of it. So this will be the final generated code. So this whole process is like a typical how a compiler will work, right? You start from parsing the code into AST, and then you analyze it, you optimize the AST, you transform the AST, and finally you generate a code out of the AST. And this is what Svelte compiler does as well. So this is roughly the process. So the first part is that we parse the code. So we read the code from the Svelte component file, and then we parse it, and then we create a component. So the code that I shown here is like loosely copied out from the Svelte source code, but in this step, what happens is that we're going to track references and dependencies, which I'll cover it later on. And then over here, the next step is we start to generate code. So there's two different kind of targets that you can compile for Svelte. One is like you generate for SSR, and one is for the client side, right? So here, after you generate, then we output it into like a file where you can consume by a build tool, or you can just write it out to a file system. So let's talk about the first step, parsing Svelte's code. So here is an Svelte source code that we are going to take a look throughout this, throughout the rest of the example, the step through for compiler. So the first thing is that Svelte implements its own parser. So the Svelte syntax is like HTML syntax, right? So Svelte will parse the HTML syntax and also logic blocks, right? And when it encounters a script tag, it will use acon to parse it. So JavaScript is fairly complex. Acon is right for the job. So Svelte is not going to parse JavaScript, but it uses acon to do it. So it also, when it encounters curly brackets within the template, it will also use acon to parse them as well. Whenever it can encounter a style tag, then it uses a library called CSS3 to parse it. So once it's being parsed, now you get all the tokens, and then we form it like an abstract syntax tree. So this is a Svelte abstract syntax tree. So if you're interested on knowing how it looks like, you can actually visit like astexplorer.net. There you can play around with like the Svelte AST. So next step, what we're going to do is doing static analysis. So here's the same code again. So it's in the AST form, but for easier visualization, we just stick it with like the source code. So the first thing what Svelte will do is that it will traverse a script tag, right? So when it encounters a variable, we're going to record it down. And then, so we have count, we have values, and then the next variable is double. So double here is a declarative variable, right? You declare double without a let. So what Svelte does here is that it will mark that this variable you need to be injected because we need to add like the declaration of it. Next thing we encounter count again. Here we mark counts as reference. So we know that we are using counts right now. And also we know that from here, double is dependent on count because you use count to evaluate double. So there's a dependency arrow drawn over there. Next, let's move on. We have data. Now data is within the scope of that curly brackets over here. So it's not like a top level variable. So you can't use this data variable in the template. So we just ignore it. Now we have I, ignore as well. Double. So now we are referencing double. So we mark it as reference. Math, it's a global, so we ignore it. And then lastly, we are assigning data to values. So we mark that values is mutated. And because we use double in like computing for the value of values, we draw a dependency like arrow for the relationship. So now we are done with the script tag. The Svelte will start to traverse through the templates, right? So we encounter the input tag, and then we see a bind directive. So over here, we see we are binding the value of count, right? So we are saying that count is being referenced in the templates, and it's also being mutated. And then we follow on, we move to the each block. Here we see that values. So in each of the logic blocks, we have created a new scope because here the each block is declaring a variable called value, and value can be only used within the each block, right? So to represent that, we draw another box represent that scope, right? So here in each blocks, what we have is that the each block is has a dependency of value, right? It depends on the value of the values, and then it creates a new variable called value. And at the same time, we mark the values as reference. And let's move into the inside of the content of the each block. We encounter like the div element tag and then the class. And then here we are referencing the value of value. So we mark it as reference, encounter it again, so mark it again, and then we are done. So once we are done with the script tag, done with the template, now we go back to the script tag again. So this time is mainly for optimization, right? So we've known that all the variables that is being used, being referenced, we know that what are being all the variables, right? So now we can do optimization. For example, we can mark whether a certain declaration, reactive declaration syntax, for example, like this one, probably we can know whether it does it need to always being evaluated or it's being static by knowing that whether count is will be updated, right? And then that is based on whether it will be mutated or not. So next thing after we've done all the optimization check, next thing we do is that we will traverse through the style. So we're going to go through each and every one of the selectors, and then we are going to, for each of the selectors that matches elements within the template, we're going to add a Svelte hash class to it. So this is for us to say scope the CSS within the component, right? So we are done with this static analysis. So let's move on to the next step where we try to generate an output code from what we have analyzed. So in the rendering step, we have two different targets. One is for the DOM and one is for SSR. So let's first look at the DOM first. So here is the code again. So a typical DOM output looks like this. We have three parts. The first part is fragment, which returns an object, which is like a recipe. So each of this method is how we create, mount, update, and destroy elements for this component. Then next we have instance. Over here, we'll talk about it later. And then lastly, we have app, the class, the component class, right? So to string all this together, you see like there's the init function that takes in instance, script fragment, and that's how all these three parts being string together. So now we want to generate code to generate the template, right? So we traverse through a template one by one and add code to insert them. So the first element we see is the input tag. So we create, so in this create method, we create a where statement to create this input element. And then in the mount method, we create like we add a statement to insert it to the target, right? And when we want to unmount, we have to remember to remove it, right? Next thing we look at is the binding. So to bind a value of an input, we need to add event listeners, right? To listen where the value change, and then we update the variable. So over here, we add like a new variable called input handler. So here is that, first thing is that, firstly, when we insert the DOM, we first set the value as the value of count, right? And then we listen to input change on the input. And so it returns a remove event listeners function. So we need to remove it when we are mounting the component. Next is that whenever the value of the count has changed, we need to update the value of inputs, right? So this will be added in the update method. Next, we move on to the each logic block. So we add another function that looks similar to create fragment. So this function will be focusing on creating elements within one each item, right? So you have shifting. So and also we have another function called get each context. So this will take in the variables and return. So this will add one more value, variable value to into the scope, right? So yeah, based on the variable statement, we need to add one more variable value, right? So I'm gonna skip through the steps on how to add, like, so basically Svelte will go through one by one elements, attributes, and then insert the code for each of the methods. And after that, let's look at the instance function, right? So what happens is that for most of the code, we will go and copy it verbatim inside the instance function. But for reactive declaration, they'll be copied and pasted into this function called self $update, right? And then for each of the statements, we are going to, based on what is being dependent. So for example, the first one is double is depending on count. So we're going to check whether count has changed before we update it. So how does it know? Again, if we pull out the dependency from this variable list, and then we know that what variables depending on it, right? So of course we have to add the input handler that we just injected previously. And then lastly, we need to return. So instance will return a list of variables that are being used inside a template. So how does it know again? We look through variables that is being referenced in the template. So finally, to make the whole reactivity works is that for all of the assignment statements, we're going to add like the invalidate state met function call right after them. So we're going to add it here, here, and here, right? So this is for the DOM, and now let's take a look at how we generate code for SSR. So here's our code again. For SSR, it's much simpler. It generates a code, something that looks like this. So general idea is that it will be a function that returns a string, right? So when we traverse, so over here, we can copy all the code from the script tag into the function to set up the variables. Next, for now we traverse the template. So we have inputs, and then for binding, because in server-side, you don't need two-way binding, right? You just need a value. So here we add the value, and then this will be like a template literal, and then expression of count. And then let's move on to each. So each will be like a function that will, like a map function. So it takes in the values, the array, and then it takes in a function that is like the item. And then here again, we're going to fast forward where we generate the strings to generate this div template, right? So this will be just for the SSR output. So the last step would be output all this as part of JS and CSS, right? So it will return, so the Svelte API will return an object that has JS and CSS, and both of them will have the output code as well as a source map so that you can refer it back. So usually you don't really need to care about this. If you're using Webpack, for example, then this will be consumed by your Svelte loader. And if you're using Rollup, this will be consumed by a Rollup plugins, Rollup plugin, right? So your bundler will consume this and then will pass it to the bundler. So in summary, a Svelte compiler comprises of these four steps: parsing the Svelte code, doing static analysis, and then the rendering step, generating a code, one for whether you, depending on whether you are generating for DOM or SSR, and then output them as JS and CSS. And that's all from me. So once again, I'm at Li Hau Tan, if any, on Twitter. So if you have any questions, definitely you can feel free to ask me now. But of course, if you want to chat more about this, you can always look out for me from Twitter. Yeah.